I want to talk a bit about the idea of love, um, which I would define for the purposes of the book as the idea that we operate in ways that respects other people's human dignity and tries to unlock other people's potential. And that is a tricky word to use, I appreciate, often in corporate environments. I did think about other kinds of words to use. Respect, I guess, is a natural word. But to be honest, I didn't want to use that word for a couple of reasons. One reason was many of the words, ingenuity, heroism, that I used in the book are not words that Ignatius would have used. You know, they're very modern sounding concepts, and he was right in the 16th century. This is one case where this is actually the word he used. You know, he talks about love a lot, not only in letters to individual Jesuits, where we might expect a more personal kind of expression, but even in the rules of the company, the corporate handbook, so to speak, the constitutions of the Jesuits talk about this. So I felt like, I had to honor what he used. And also, frankly, respect, I guess, is the most natural alternative, but that's a word that, in my experience, has gotten very devalued and watered down, and we almost are cynical about it in a lot of organizations. In other words, every company has respect as a corporate value, or something like it. And some companies are deeply respectful places. A lot of organizations are places where we feel actually, okay, this is what's written on the wall or on a piece of paper in a brochure, but then the way people treat each other is completely different, and so we kind of we talk the talk, but we don't walk the talk, and that really, spurs very deep cynicism in organizations when people see that kind of thing going on. So I felt like, all right, look, I don't want to play into that feeling. Let me sort of try to get around that a bit, and therefore I use this word. And St. Ignatius at one point says that love ought to manifest itself in deeds, not in words. So the point is not that we go around saying to people we love them or this kind of stuff. I never did that. Rather, that we champion a set of behaviors that manifest qualities of concern for other stakeholders that are around us. So, for example, how about this as love in action with absolute bottom line impact? Surely no chief executive who loved his or her employees would have recklessly gambled their pensions and livelihoods in order to prop up his or her stock option value through fraud, like folks at easily half a dozen companies we could each name who've been featured in some of these scandals in the last few years. I think there's a completely legitimate example. If you're entrusted with other human beings in a fiduciary sense as your shareholders or as your subordinates or as your customers or as your investors or pensioners, what do you owe people? Simply because they're human beings and you have a fiduciary tie to them. That example is a legitimate one, but it also has a negative kind of feel to it, I guess. The sense that love could help us in organizations by helping us steer clear of some of these outrageous ethical misdeeds we've kind of read about. And I also want to flip this around and talk about it in a very positive sense. Everybody knows that children learn better and perform more effectively when they feel safe, and when people make them know that they're valuable, and when they're raised in environments that have discipline in them. And how did we ever convince ourselves that our adult needs are somehow different? The best teams that I was ever on at JP Morgan were teams where we trusted each other, where we were more interested in helping each other win than watch each other fail, where we didn't stab each other in the back, and where we held each other very accountable to high enough standards that made each person and the whole team better performing. Now, I think we could look at a bundle of behaviors like this and say this is how love can manifest itself in workplace. If part of the motive for why we treat other people this way is that we feel like, well, look, human beings are not the same as computers or wrenches or tools that we use and then throw in the garbage, but rather human beings are unique and they have a dignity that we all have to respect. You know, if you look at surveys, you see that rarely do more than 50% of people in any large company or organization say they're happy in their work. And you know, a striking percentage of people say that they don't even trust their own senior managers. Well, you know, if we have environments like this, people are not performing at optimal productivity. So I talk about this value of love in the workplace, not because I feel like we all ought to be nice to each other for niceness sake, although I think that would be good in terms of my own beliefs, but rather because I think this is key to making us more productive. And I, like anyone in a market system, wants organizations, including any that I'm involved with, to be as productive as possible and to you know, create maximum returns from whatever is invested in us.